It's Reiki, but not as you know it. Hello there, Linda.
Hello, hello. Let me stop my boots, get the snow off, take off this big coat that makes me feel like the Michelin Man. Um,
Robertson Cops has definitely come to Roman nose
yes,
today, hasn't it?
most definitely. And let's make sure we're really close to the fire because I'm frozen. I am frozen.
Absolutely. I know it's midwinter and all, but
Yeah, but it's okay. It's good. It's good.
absolutely, yes. It's happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you too.
What have you been up to recently?
Well, I've been doing a lot of exploring. I tend to like to go outdoors, providing I'm very bundled, and explore a lot of places. I tend to like to go when there's no one except the elements, and quite the experience. I had a few interesting encounters, and the stories will follow.
I do love a good story.
They're going to be different than what you expect, I think.
Oh, oh, that's even more intriguing now. So, do you think that I might need a tipple to steady my nerves?
Is there ever a reason why we need to have a tipple? I mean, really.
Well, I didn't want to say anything, but
It is the holidays after all.
absolutely. Oh, and if by magic, here is a tipple. Oh, wow, this one looks lovely, and it smells amazing. I can smell nutmeg and cloves and cinnamon and allspice. Oh, it's a lovely, lovely smell.
Yeah, absolutely. Is that from yours or mine?
Well, I think it's from mine, but it could be from yours as well.
Ah, what color would you say yours is?
It's a sort of a brown. I always hesitate when I use the word brown now.
As you should, as you should.
But there
It
is not
looks,
a hint of pond scum or
oh
dungeon
no.
filth or anything with this
Oh,
one. It is
oh
like
no. Oh no.
it's like a Christmas pudding in a glass. It's wonderful.
Okay. Well, Cornelia has promised us no more disgusting tipples. So yeah, I would say yours is brown, but you think it's thick like a pudding?
It's very liquidy. It's just that the flavor and the smell is very, very Christmas
Because of the
puddingy
spices. Yes,
because of the
yes, yes, yes.
spices. Yes, it's those lovely warming Christmas spices.
Right. Mine, as you can see, mine is in a mug, so we can't really see what's inside. It is topped with marshmallows.
Well, that's a
Um,
good start.
I, I hope.
Unless, of course, it's like the glamour. It's actually pond scum, but with a
No, no, no,
glamour
no,
over
no,
the
no,
top to make it look.
no, 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 no. There is a really cool spoon in there too. She told me she created it in honor of the season. And she said, it's the most wonderful time of the year.
Oh,
Toddy.
oh,
So the marshmallows are good, but she said, don't be surprised when you go in a little deeper. Don't be surprised and don't be spooked.
oh, how very mysterious.
Yes. So I don't really know. It smells good. Just makes me a little apprehensive.
So, on my way into the tavern this evening, I found a book in the snow, which I picked up thinking that someone may have dropped it on their way in, or more likely on their way out after a few tipples.
Yep.
As I handed it to Cornelia, I saw it was A Christmas Carol.
Oh,
I've always loved The Christmas Carol as a story.
I have as well.
Yeah. There have been so many adaptations. It's so well known.
Right. We've all been exposed to it.
Yes, absolutely. Essentially, it's 4 short stories wrapped into one. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge's behaviour as a miser and thoroughly all-round Grinch,
Absolutely.
and who has an encounter with his old business partner, recently dead and now with his own fashion line in chainwear.
Yes.
This contains 3 other stories of the past, the present, and the future. Inspired by these, Scrooge changes his ways and completes his story by transforming his behaviour and changing the narratives. Meeting the 3 ghosts of Christmas is a wonderful metaphor for our own lives. How the choices we made in the past inform the lives we have now, just as each and every choice now creates our future. If only we had a way of communicating with our future ghosts. But I love how the story reminds us, the audience, to be kind and to love those around us. And this is the nature of story. Stories are how we learn and how we navigate the world. This essence of all of these different experiences from the past, the present, and the future, and how they apply to us and our own ghosts and the ghosts that we have created in our own lifetime, is such a powerful one for this time of year, because it's as the dark nights roll in and as the year comes to an end, we do tend to be much more reflective about where our life has been and where our life is going.
Right.
And how the stories that surround us can perhaps help us to honour the past, to make better choices in the present, and to have insight into the unknown that is just around the corner.
Yes, absolutely. Well said. Ooh,
Thank you. It was quite eloquent, wasn't it?
yes.
Ask me again after I've had some of this tip on. It might not be as eloquent or as unslurred. With that in mind, shall we share some stories?
Oh, yes. I would love to hear your stories, and I have a few to share as well.
Oh, I'd love to hear them. I always love your stories, and particularly the one with the pentangle under the bed and the
Oh,
screaming. I love that one.
oh,
Did they ever recover? Were they ever found?
no. I might have said that a little too quickly.
Your secret's safe with me.
Oh, we can't have giggles. My jaw is hurting from laughing.
We're going to have a terrible opinion of you if I keep saying these things on.
That's okay. In the north, there is a land of breathtaking magnificence, forged by the mighty forces of weather, water, wind, and time. A winding path leads you through a gorge along a hidden river. Many do not venture there during the wintertide, for the area can become unusually cold and icy, making it treacherous to journey through. Yet others warn not to travel, because the steep, jagged rock walls of the chasm take on an eerie look to them, where the gigantic boulders look like sentinels guarding the frozen waterfalls, as if they are a portal into another place. This tale is one I became aware of when reading a long-forgotten journal of someone who did not listen to the warnings, but bravely went on this forest adventure trail. Her life needed direction, for she was engulfed with so many emotions she wanted to shed, desperately wanting to feel alive again. Bundled in her warmest clothing, she approached what appeared to be a fortress-like entrance. Gone was the glorious sunshine, leaving her surrounded by a frigid yet clear night. With every step she took, her boots crunched loudly, breaking through the icy crust of snow. She struggled to keep from slipping and sliding, for there were nooks and crannies of unknown depths, hidden by moss-covered rocks, with fallen leaves and snow covering everything. Suddenly, with one slight misstep, the earth swallowed her. She landed on a soft layer of pine needles. As she regained her senses, she noticed she was in a cavern. After checking to be sure she was uninjured, she looked around to see if there was a way out. As her eyes and ears adjusted to her surroundings, the cavern was filled with humming sounds all around her. From music to words, she thought she could hear a rhyme. 1 for sorrow, 2 for joy, 3 for a girl, and 4 for a boy. Fire for silver, 6 for gold, 7's a secret, never to be told. This was out of this world to her. Where was this place? Was she even in the same reality? She found her way out of the cavern. At the opening, the light of the full moon shone down on her and what lied ahead. Surrounded by tall evergreens, she could hear the mighty forces of the water, and at some points, as if the sound was coming from underground. Ahead was a bridge which extended across the icy waters. Dare she cross? It appeared to be strong and sturdy. As she placed one step on the bridge and then the next, she had an overwhelming feeling of childhood traumas long buried. These memories flew up and around her like ghostly apparitions, some taunting, whilst others laughed at her, calling her unkind names. She felt those feelings of isolation and being unwanted all over again. With emotions of anger, then grief, tears began to run down her face. For these tears were for the child who had no one to help her. Yet, wasn't she now the one who braved this journey, when everyone told her not to? In that moment of realization, her tears became her internal polarity, surrounding herself and the bridge. This path she was on helped her discover the liberation without limitation. She was never seen again. For the person who went into the night, blissfully transformed. So in the United States, Christmas ghost stories aren't really a big thing. The Christmas Carol is well known, but from what I've gathered, it was something that was traditionally done in the UK, um,
Yes.
for a long time. So I'm curious to know, did you have Christmas time ghost stories growing up? Did you experience that tradition? Because I know I didn't.
Well, it's a fascinating thing, actually, because here in the UK, we didn't have ghost stories growing up. So by then, the tradition had actually ended.
Oh,
The only ghost story that was relevant to Christmas is the Christmas
the
Carol.
Christmas Carol.
So, so universally, the Christmas ghost story. However, in the Victorian era, authors like Dickens and Wilkie Collins and a lot of the contemporaries there did write these short ghost stories for Christmas, and they were published in journals so that the family would gather around on Christmas Eve and around the Christmas period and actually read these ghost stories.
Right.
And there was a real link and connection between the supernatural and Christmas. So, in many ways, ghosts were synonymous with the Christmas period.
I know for the US history, let's just say, a lot of the Irish and Scottish immigrants brought over a lot of ghost stories. For some reason in the US, that was shuffled in the box of Halloween. But in fact, these were stories that were told during the winter solstice when the days became shortened and the light of the day ended sooner and people just came in and sat around the fire. And what do, aside drinking a few tipples?
Absolutely, which is, very acceptable.
Very acceptable, and stories. And it was just a matter, and I could envision this of, just getting that endorphin rush so that you get the adrenaline pumping. Because let's face it, when you're in the dark for so long, when your days are shorter and you're not outdoors as much as during the other times of the year, you need something to jumpstart you, and ghost stories will do it. So it was interesting to me. And of course, I'm of Irish and Scottish descent, so makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fascinating thing is, in terms of story and the history of storytelling,
Mhm.
is how communities would gather round the fire around the midwinter and the solstice. And when the dark nights were there, so around that darkest part of the year, it would be a real time for communities to get together and tell stories and share these stories because they were ways of learning and growing socially and culturally.
Right,
So their stories would be very much about the things in the night and the things in the dark, the things that cannot be named,
right,
because there was this tradition around the fire that if you named it, if you spoke it by name, it would hear you and you would get its attention, and
right,
then it would be interested in you. So
right,
you
right.
didn't name those out in the dark. And stories were a way of transmitting that knowledge and sharing that knowledge from ancestor through the different generations.
Right.
So the ghost story tradition and the tradition of that out in the dark is one that is ancient and goes right the way back to the Celts and even predates the Celts,
Right.
because that was the way that they knew not only things that they needed to know in life, how to survive, for example, and real world dangers, but also the supernatural dangers
Hmm.
and the supernatural knowledge that needed to be shared.
Right. And then religion stepped in and decided, nope, we're not having any of that.
Absolutely, yes, yeah, and it became sort of heresy.
But it's interesting because again, in my reading, how from England to the United States before it became the United States, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was very much influenced, because they were Puritans,
Mm.
very much influenced in controlling what someone could or could not do, someone could practice or not practice. And one of them was the Christmas time storytelling and how it was squashed, basically. And that in the colony, if you were a practicing, I don't know how you could get away with not being a Puritan, but being part of that colony, because they were so strict and so controlling. But if you were a merchant, for example, and you did some sort of ritualistic practice, innocent, like baking or cooking a certain foods in celebration of a certain festival, they were actually fined
Mm.
a monetary value that was very high for them, to stop them from doing that. And it just made me sit back and think of how dogma can really mess things up. There's nothing wrong with storytelling. It's part of the evolution of humans.
Yeah.
To your point, it relayed down the line of families. This is what you need to be careful for, and this is why. And granted, it was steeped with superstition and perhaps, a little bit of supernatural that we know is different, but that's denying who you are in the whole. Having something that is part of a family unit, community unit, and having that ripped away from them. I'm sure a lot went underground. I would have been one of them.
Yeah. And there's real power in story. That's the crux of the matter is that these stories contain power,
Yeah.
and they have the ability to change hearts and minds.
Hmm.
And so people in authority who kept and maintained their authority by using a particular type of story
Hmm.
and controlling the narrative using those stories didn't want other stories to be told, because that's
Right.
where those little seeds of dissension and those little
Yeah.
seeds of magic came through.
Right.
So the idea of storytelling as a way of communicating magic, communicating hidden mysteries, the secrets of the universe that could be depicted within and decoded by the oral tradition stories, particularly.
Right.
In Victorian times, in terms of the Victorian authors who wrote ghost stories for Christmas, there was very much this religious theme going throughout. Victorians were very Christian. It was a very somber time in history, a very conservative time in history. And so the ghost stories were very much there to communicate the value of the Christian religion,
Right.
and also to highlight some of the detrimental aspects of society, some of the failings of society,
Right.
and how people had a Christian duty to transcend these faults and to rectify them, to address them, to work to finding a solution to them. Particularly Dickens was very, very socially focused. So
Right.
a lot of his stories looked at the wealthy and how the wealthy treat the poor, and the societal responsibilities towards those who were less fortunate.
Right. That
He had
the
a
whole industrial revolution period where, the laborers were so ill-treated and disregarded, and just another warm body can fill the slot if something happens to the one.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
That the idea of the chattel. We are all chattels of the country that we live in, so we are
Right.
there to serve them and as assets. And this idea still exists today. It's not
It does.
quite as prominent as it was back then, but if we think about Victorian Britain, and particularly the London area of Victorian England, there was this sense of even children
Hmm.
as young as 4 years old were sent up chimneys. Very, very dangerous
Right.
trade that they had. They would get stuck up there and nobody could get them out. there was no schooling, there was no education. The workhouses were the norm. So even young children and orphans were sent to the workhouses, as we see in Oliver Twist.
Right.
That was society. It was brutal, and if you were poor, it was brutal beyond words.
Tremendous. Yeah.
And that's what those stories, a lot of those stories were about, and the idea of the ghost being this beyond life entity that was a statement of, you need to do better, you need to help those who need help, you need to be more charitable, you need to be less self-centered and not think of yourself.
Right.
And so these still, stories were telling secrets and knowledge, and sharing how people needed to step up and look after the others less fortunate in their societies.
Right. Right. And that can be applied today.
Absolutely.
Take religion out of it, because it
Yep.
doesn't need to be there. It
No.
can be if you choose to have it there, if that is, let's just say, for lack of a better word, motivates you. But I think it can be implemented as is. One day, she packed a few things in a travel bag. She left at the first flush of morning, her favorite time, when only the animals were waking quietly and without human sounds. There was a light mist gathering around small shrubs. The mists seemed to be hanging on and holding tightly, hoping the early morning sun rays would not notice them. She traveled for some time, oftentimes becoming mesmerized by the miles covered, only to be startled at how far she had gone without a recollection of the countryside, towns, and crossroads she had passed. She found herself deep in the White Mountains, where there are streams, brooks, rivers, and many valleys. Crossing a bridge where a winding river heads down into a woodland area, she noticed a dirt road to her right. This road doesn't look heavily traveled, but she eased the caravan carefully down the lane and up and down through the washed-out areas. There are many trees on either side of the road, some very ancient, whilst others in their early years of life. The ground in the woodlands beyond are covered with fallen leaves from the previous years. This amplified all the sounds coming down from deep areas of this place. She hears great horned owls gathering. They call out as if asking, "Who goes there?" She came to an old gate which crossed the road. As she inspected it, she noted it was not locked, nor was there any posting prohibiting her to continue onward. On the post in which the gate hinged, she saw the letters BVP. Carefully, she unhooked the gate and pushed it forward. It was set up with a counterweight, which, after hooking the latch to a corresponding post inside the gate, it was easily released and the gate closed by itself. The area opened to a large field, showing golden in the fading light of day. Being in the wintertime months, and with the days much shorter than in summer, she realized she best find a spot for the caravan to settle in. The field was surrounded by mountains, buffered by woodland all around. She could hear the river somewhere towards the north. On the south side of the field was a very large old barn. By the looks of it, it had seen many winters, perhaps at least 300 years worth. She thought this would be a good spot to set up camp. Once settled, and with a little bit more light of the day left, she decided to hike up one of the deer paths to get a good viewpoint of the area before settling in for the night. She found herself following a rain-washed-out area, much easier to climb rather than trying to climb over fallen trees and outcroppings of rocks. She noticed just over the crest a small cabin. It seemed uninhabited, and if she were honest with herself, a little uninviting. Obviously, it had been lived in at one time, and she wanted to respect whatever or whoever was still there. As she approached it closer, she was taken aback at the sight, for in front of the cabin, a great opening of the trees revealed the valley below. The sun was approaching the mountaintop of the furthest mountain in the west. It was breathtaking. She stood very still, just enjoying the peace and wonder of it all. As was her habit whenever visiting a special place, she liked to take back something to remind her of the experience. She asked if she could take something from the place. It didn't have to be anything grand, a rock, a bit of oak moss, but her favorite in woodland areas, a pine cone. As she began scanning the ground, tiny pine cones fell at her feet. She looked up and around, but did not see any pine trees directly in her area. What she did see were mighty oaks, tall and strong. As she knelt to pick up the pine cones, she noticed within the pine scales a vibrant color of rich, vivid crimson. She smiled to herself and said, "Thank you," out loud. Without any sound to warn her of his approach, she looked up and saw a man. He appeared to be just as shocked to see her as she was of him. They did not speak. She smiled and placed the pine cones gently into her vest pocket. She noticed the man was dressed in somewhat outdated clothing, but then reminded herself where she was and how she could certainly understand why clothing wasn't an important statement to make in this place. She thanked him, not really knowing what else to say, and started to make her way back down the path. As she settled for the night in her caravan, she remembered the gift of pine cones and placed them in a small basket on the table and fell into a deep, restful sleep. The next morning was crisp and very cold. She dressed quickly and went out looking for some dead wood to start a fire. To her surprise, she saw someone coming towards her from the north side of the field. He did not look happy to see her. She mustered up some courage and walked towards him, waving a greeting of hello. She hoped it would soften his mood. She had heard this neck of the woods did not welcome strangers. Why did she even think this was a good idea to come here? But then remembered, she really didn't choose this place. It was as if it almost chose her. After a little bit of uncomfortable words, she finally convinced the man she meant no disrespect,
but only found this place to be peaceful. And without seeing anyone about, and certainly no trespassing signs, she thought it would be okay to stay the night. When mentioning the no trespassing sign, the man became upset all over again, indicating there was a no trespassing sign clearly nailed to the gate. She shook her head in disbelief, and as they walked together towards the gate, sure enough, there was the sign. She apologized and informed him she would pack up immediately and leave. As they walked back to the caravan, she mentioned she was surprised the man she met the evening before didn't tell her she was trespassing, and how he was quiet in general. And as she looked at the man, she found his face had gone ashen. He stepped away from her and looked in the direction of the old cabin up in the mountain. He asked her to describe the man she saw, which she did in detail. He grew even more pallid and said, "That was Bob Church." She showed him the tiny pine cones and told him Bob had gifted them to her as a keepsake of their meeting. The man's voice hitched a bit, but after taking a deep breath, he pointed towards a path which led into the woodland. He told her the path led to a whole grove of red pine trees, in which Bob Church planted by hand. He turned to her and said, "They're not up by his cabin, and there's only one way you would have gotten those, and that would be if he gave them to you." She thought nothing of this, since why would that be such a big deal if this Bob Church gave them to her? Then he told her why. For Bob Church had been dead for some time.
Particularly a value in terms of the storytelling tradition is how we use it in one therapy and in the realms. Because when you give people information, when you tell them about a thing, the way that the human mind works is it's constantly trying to judge and shut down. So you give pieces of information, little nuggets of data and knowledge, and the recipient is, do I understand that shut down? Do I understand that shut down? Shut down.
Right.
So it's constantly they're preempting. Do I know this? Do I know this? Oh, yes, I know this. Yes, I know this.
Right.
So even when you're explaining information about something that they have no clue, the moment there is a connecting point in their brain, they shut it down to, yeah, I know this.
Yeah.
So, for example, when we talk about something like Celtic Reiki, a lot of people in the more well-known and commonplace Sui Reiki will have an opinion on Celtic Reiki because it's information. So the information that is around Celtic and Reiki is not Celtic.
Right,
It's Japanese. It's informational. So you just
right.
take the information of the name Celtic Reiki, and people shut it down because they're thinking, well, it's not. It's Japanese, so how can it be? And then there are some people that take that information Celtic Reiki, and they think, oh, is it a Celtic version of Reiki?
Right.
So, there's all of these sort of informational things that happen. As soon as you start to tell stories and you start to relate things in stories, particularly when people go deeply into those stories and start to decipher the messages behind the scenes, they
Hmm.
get a much more all-encompassing and rich experience of those stories and what those stories mean,
Hmm.
in ways that rather than shutting our brain down, they open it up to
Right.
possibility. And that's the real power of story. And it's why we use story so much
Oh,
in
absolutely.
the realms.
Absolutely. And, this is ancient history at this point, but I can remember, and you probably don't remember because it's a lifetime and a half ago, but I had a number of acquaintances that were Asui Reiki practitioners, and many of them, including those that were not practitioners, would say to me, "Oh, you should become," and I'm using air bunnies here, "a Reiki practitioner, a Reiki master." And I thought, nah, it doesn't resonate with me. But I was searching, I was trying to figure out, like, what am I going to be when I grow up? And I actually dreamt and heard Celtic Reiki in my dream. And I literally like woke up that next morning, and I have very vivid dreams. I woke up and I thought, Celtic Reiki, that makes no sense because again, I only knew Asui Reiki. So to me, Reiki was Reiki, and it was Asui Reiki, but it was called Reiki. That crazy misinformation in my brain. So I thought, well, what is Celtic Reiki? So I did what most normal people do these days. I started Googling Celtic Reiki, and there was a plethora of stuff out there. And I would read it and I'd say, now that's Asui Reiki. That's not Celtic Reiki. What is Celtic Reiki? What is Celtic Reiki? And I came upon a link for your book, Stories from the Sacred Grove. And I thought, oh, what's this? And I totally, without thinking, which was the best thing in the world for me, because sometimes I think too much, I ordered the book and could not put it down. I read it from cover to cover a few times, and with stories I had never heard. Yet there was something about the stories that just clicked. There were certain things that you said that I said to myself, I've said that. Why would I have said something like that? Why would I have felt something like that? Which was the beginning of my journey to where I'm at now. So stories are really important. You hear something, you say, oh, I know what that is, or you reject it because you want to focus, you think you want to focus on something you don't know. Sometimes you have to slow it down a little bit and really listen to the story, not just hear the words and say, oh, it's this, and then it gets checked off the box in your brain and you don't pursue it further. And there are many times when you need to really listen to the story. And that's when it reveals itself to be more than what you think. Because had I not read Stories from the Sacred Grove, I'm not sure I'd be here today. And it's a little book, as you know. It is a wonderful book, though. It's a little book, but it's such a power pack, the impact that it had on me. I instantly knew this is the path I need to go on. Who is this guy?
And it was all downhill from there.
No.
Oh, that's
Oh my
lovely. Thank you.
goodness.
Thank you, Linda. That's lovely to hear. And there there was never any hesitation for me that the first book that I authored about Celtic Reiki needed to be a book of stories, that I
Yeah,
couldn't give the information as information. I needed to tell the stories around
right,
it,
right.
because just to give information, just to tell people the data, the
Yeah.
facts and the figures, it strips the magic from
Hmm.
Celtic Reiki.
Hmm.
Whereas in Stories from the Sacred Grove, there was this sense of building a community, sitting around the campfire telling the stories of the creation and early days of the Celtic Reiki experience from my perspective, and inviting people in to that community where we could all sit around and share our own stories, and creating a space for people to share their stories. Because I never wanted it to be just my story. I wanted it to be all of the stories of the people who came to this place. And that's one of the challenges that I always have experienced with Usui Reiki, in as much as there is one particular story in Usui Reiki, which is sort of the starting point, and that is Mikao Usui's journey up the mountain to meditate, and his experience of what he called Reiki, with the light coming down, and how that changed his life and inspired him. And that story is the starting point for many people's journey in the Reiki therapy experience. And it doesn't leave room for their own story, for their own experiences, for the tales they need to tell and share, because it's all about the originator. In the creation of Celtic Reiki, Karmic Reiki, and the other modalities of Reiki that I created in those early days, I never wanted it to be solely about me, the originator. I wanted it to be very community-based, and a place where people come and share their stories, because every story here is valid. And that's the wonder of it, is that it is a place of story.
Right. And it's very fluid and it's very expansive, because when you share a story that sparks something in the listener, which helps them explore to find their own experience and then be able to share it, it's just wonderful links that just keep building. And that's very attractive to me personally. And I think that's why I never went towards Usui Reiki, because I thought, well, okay, that's fine. That's a very one-dimensional look at something. I need multi-dimensional in all forms.
Yeah. The winter house stood just beyond the town, far enough to be too far away to walk, and not so far as to be forgotten. A quaint Victorian relic, it seemed to present an air of foreboding, as if something were not quite as it should be. Walls stood upright, aligned perfectly with ceiling and floor. The rooms offered shelter from the cold and the wind, both prevalent in this part of the country, each room promising the allure of safety, as they had done for 200 years, and would do for 200 more. Yet there was a strange countenance to the facade of the building. The brickwork was a little too precise, the windows a little too dark. Something had happened here, so terrible it changed the way the light interacts with the place, reflected at too harsh an angle for any natural aspect, and refracted too darkly to be caused by anything benevolent. As the night wrapped its fingers around the edifice, a pristine layer of snow attempted to offer a little light to something so dark. The air was crisp and the night was silent, save for the muffled crunching of footsteps as Dawn and Alan approached the defiant front door. Their car had decided the last few miles of the journey home was too great an inconvenience, and drifted to a halt on the road a short walk from the house. With the snowstorm fast approaching, the couple knew they must seek refuge, for the walk was too far and the night was too savage. and even the local rumours about the winter house were little deterrent when it came to that biting sting of cold. The couple had laughed at the ramblings of those who had lived in the town their entire lives, whispers of lingering spirits who roamed the halls, tales of strange occurrences that sent shivers down the spine, tales of those who dared to spend a night within. Folklore and superstition, Alan would mutter with a wry smile and a slight shake of the head. Yes, but wouldn't it be exciting to see one? Dawn had whispered with a breathy delight, excited at the prospect, but hushed at her own foolishness for wanting to believe. The allure of a warm hearth and shelter proved too tempting to resist in the face of mere fantasy, especially for Alan, who had never believed in anything he couldn't see. Dawn and Alan pushed open the door, which screamed in protest, as one might who moved their joints a little too quickly after hours of sitting in one position. They made their way inside, the beams from their phones casting fingers of light that pointed aggressively through the blackness of the entrance hall. We all know those people who can walk into a room and cause even the most exuberant mood to crash lifeless to the floor. It was as if this place was filled with those who knew how to soak up the light in the same way. For whilst bright and defiant, the torches seemed to falter in their endeavour against the all-pervading shroud they poked without response. It was not long before Dawn and Alan had found some pieces of wood to burn and settled into the living room, the crackling fireplace casting dancing shadows onto the fading wallpaper. The air inside was heavy with a sense of history, and the couple found themselves drawn into the anecdotes that seemed to seep from the very foundations of the house. Alan's watch buzzed a warning for the witching hour, and the temperature dropped like a rock succumbing to gravity's lease. An ethereal chill crystallised the room, seeming to materialise from every molecule. For this was not a draught or passing zephyr, but a stealing of the warmth that came from the still air itself. The shadows appeared to snatch the light of the fire, making the room seem as obsidian in every corner and nook, a scrying mirror that grasped the space around them like a prison cell. The couple huddled close, seeking comfort in each other's presence. A soft whisper echoed through the house, carrying fragments of forgotten conversations. The ghosts of this husk, trapped more by their own trauma than the walls themselves, stirred with a newfound vigour. Footsteps echoed in the hallway just outside the living room, quiet at first, as if somewhere else in the house, but ever approaching, louder, keener in pace and clarity of step. Suddenly, what the couple might have described as a cold breeze, but was more in sound and action like a sharp intake of breath, extinguished the fire. As it sucked the light and the heat from the air, plunging the room into darkness, the space became charged with an otherworldly countenance. The couple fumbled for matches to relight the extinguished flame. Whispers grew louder, and the shadows seemed to shimmer and move. The footsteps reached the door of the living room, coming to rest directly outside. In the flickering light of the match, Dawn and Alan glimpsed fleeting apparitions, faces etched with sorrow and laughter and yearning, frozen in time. The ghosts glided around them, their presence palpable yet intangible, real and yet somehow not. The couple felt a mixture of fear and fascination at the strange dance of those incarcerated by the winter house. The door of the living room swept open as if being wrenched from its hinges, The loud clatter as it rebounded with a shuddering cacophony of creaks and moans was quickly silenced as if the sound was immediately ingested, leaving only a dull thud. And it moved into the room, the dark form that was all at once there and not there. It towered over them, far too grand in height and general in scale to be of this world, as if the thing began in some other place and continued beyond the grasp of human comprehension. It was as if this thing merely punctured a hole in our world and seeped through from ceiling to floor like some dark spectral worm. Yet the figure had a form which resembled a human in many ways. The shoulder, the arms, the peculiar frame of the side of a contorted face, a smiling face. Dawn recognized the feeling it provoked in her. It was that of death. She knew it so well. It tasted like that of her mother's last breath. Dawn had breathed her mum in so deeply and held the breath in her lungs so long she thought she might faint, never wanting to exhale that last living remnant of her out, the woman who had been everything to Dawn her entire life. Dawn caught herself holding her breath, just as she had done on that day, in that moment. This thing pouring over her was like that of her brother when the depression had taken him. For months there was this sense she had all the time, unable to shake it or give it any real definition or countenance. It was just there, clinging on until that morning when the phone rang and she knew what had happened, because the sensation had gone. That same sensation she felt in every fibre of her being now. It was the feeling she had in the moments before, when they were driving, and she felt herself being twisted to the side sharply as if there were the headlights of the car reflected against the tree, so clear and etched upon her mind in such detail that she turned to Alan to see him staring into some other place, his eyes wide and transfixed upon the entity that stood ossified in front of them, its tall, never-ending frame arcing over their heads. "No!" Dawn shouted with a defiant roar. "This is not happening!" She breathed in the air and held it in her lungs, tightly clamping down with every muscle to hold on to that oxygen. Her thoughts clamped down like a fist in rebellion against the inevitable. This was not real. She paralysed herself in place to stop the next moment from happening, the next moment that would be, for sure, her end. So as she sat, petrified as a tree that had turned to stone through age and weather, a testament to the passage of time and what once was, in her refusal to move beyond this moment of pain and darkness and terror, she sat, holding on to a moment for fear of the next moment and all those after. We get stuck in our moments and memories, refusing to move beyond that thing which bears down upon us with a gravity stronger than life itself. We refuse to step beyond the traumas and the pain, even though it may only be a step or two ahead that offers us closure and release of our troubles. And the resistance to move on keeps us in the winter house, the place where the dead aspects of ourselves fester on, the joys we lost, the regrets we made, and the hurts that we cling to. For when we stay trapped, we never get to see the light of dawn, the warmth of another day, a better day, a different day. We simply stay in the winter house, looping around and around that darkness. That darkness begins in some faraway, unreachable place and travels into eternity without end. For the moment of release lets us walk on, lets us rest, lets us breathe again. Yet until that release, we stay trapped in the moment before, ever caught in the cold embrace of the winter house. It fascinates me how we live in a very transactional society, particularly in the West. It's so transactional in the way that we approach life.
Mm-hmm.
And when Usui Reiki came across to the States from Japan, the reworking of the ethos around Usui Reiki therapy that was made that way for the American audience and the Western audience made it very transactional.
Yeah.
So the versions of Usui Reiki that are around in the Western world are based on transaction and are very sanitized in terms of how each transaction is undertaken, even down to 3 minutes, the 3-minute thing.
Oh, yes.
This hand position for 3 minutes, this hand position for 3 minutes, 2 cups of flour and 2 eggs and a cup of sugar, and bake for it. It's very recipe based.
Yeah.
And each of those 3 minutes is a transaction. When we start to look at the original forms as best we know them, because we know so little from the early days of Usui Reiki, but when we start to sort of tease some of those earlier elements, we see a lot less transaction. There's still transactional elements there, usually based on a more Eastern transactional philosophy, but there's some real fluidity in those early practices, particularly things like Reiki Ho, for example, where this sense of fluidity comes into the treatment, and it is the most magical, magnetic, gravitational experience that you never ever know where it's going to go.
Right.
So there are these lovely elements there of fluidity which transcend the transactional nature. And what is fascinating to me is very much how the transactional approach appeals to a certain Reiki therapy practitioner. The not so transactional bits, the bits that are really fluid, that need to be communicated through story, because you transactionalize something by giving data upon it rather than story. But the more story-based modalities and ways of communicating the learning of Reiki therapy, they don't appeal to the transactional mind. You need that fluid, story-based, ever-evolving, changing, transformative mindset to really be able to uncover the secrets behind it. And that is where I sort of find it so compelling in terms of Reiki therapy moving forward into the future. How there is this movement to make it more about the fluidity and the fluid nature of our human experience, and the contemporary context with which we use a therapy. So using a therapy from 150 odd years ago doesn't have as much relevance now in its transactional form as a fluid therapy or a fluid modality that is constantly adapting and changing for the needs of a modern society.
Right.
And I think this is where the use of story is so powerful, because a story can be set in Victorian England. It can be set in the America of puritanical Christians,
Right.
or it can be set in the 21st century digital experience of our very fast-paced and overwhelming world. Those stories offer clues and secrets on how we can live a more fulfilling and benevolent life through the experience of Reiki as our universal constant companion.
Right, right. And that's not to say that we disregard anything from the past.
No.
It's more of gleaning an aspect of it that is worth carrying forward. But not everything needs to get carried forward. It's never forgetting what was, because that helps you see your projection forward.
Yes.
There are so many things that are coming up in society now that I look at probably very differently than most. Just how people are becoming so concerned with AI, for example, and how, people are panicking and thinking, they're going to take over. And if you look over through history, okay, they didn't have AI back then, but they had something that drastically changed how things were. Think about the Industrial Revolution, the farmers, the people who worked the land, the shop owners, the dressmakers, everything that was done by hand. And all of a sudden, the age of engines and mechanical devices to produce in large quantities the very products that these people were creating, they felt threatened. They thought, this is the end of the world. The sky is falling. It goes on and on and on. Bring it to current times where, and this might get a lot of slack out there, but people are so concerned about gender identification. To me, it's what's the big deal? And yet, because people are so accustomed to things being a certain way, and because, yes, media has a lot to do with stirring the pot.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
But guess what, people? This has been around forever. People identify in themselves whatever. This is not a new thing. This is just something that is now being revealed, and you don't like it. I recently read something that kind of made me laugh, because I can personally attest to this. Back in the 50s, school systems were really pushing children to be right-handed. If you showed any disposition, anything leaning you towards being a left-handed, oh, that was bad news. So they really enforced it. And if you went to a Catholic school, your knuckles probably got slapped. A side note, I went to a Catholic school for 1 year and then I got kicked out. So we will go and talk to that story another time.
Oh, was that the rampant Satanism again, Linda? I've told you about that.
but so my grandmother lived with us. She was born in 1891. So she was very old school. Loved her to death, respected her. I adored the ground she walked on. I was born left-handed, and I can remember my grandmother saying to me, "Oh, don't use your left hand. You've got to learn to use your right hand, because people are going to think you're a cripple." This is from somebody who loved me. And it was a big deal. It was such a big deal. I remember in the second grade, because I'm a kamikaze and it was wintertime, I broke my right arm. And in second grade, that's when you learned how to write cursive writing. Well, guess who had to use a pencil in her left hand? And I did, much to the chagrin of my grandmother. But the point of the story is, after a few years, the whole craze of you must be right-handed or you'll be considered a reject. Do you hear about that anymore? Not at all.
Absolutely.
So it's funny how little things trigger people. And if you look at where the panic is today and put it in context to what I just described about something changing from what they know, you are going to get fear. You are going to get, no, this is not right. And fear creates control
Yeah.
and dogma and being picky about what someone feels, what somebody wants to have for their life, or whether they're left-handed or right-handed. Does it really matter?
Yeah. I resonate very much with that story because I remember my mum telling me about her experiences as a left-handed person in school. And she didn't go to a Catholic school. She went to a public school, or to a state school.
Right, right, right.
And she definitely had the blackboard eraser smacked over her hand a few
Oh,
times.
at least it was soft.
Oh no, it was wood. They were
Oh,
made of wood, so
oh,
yeah. They were like a wooden brush type thing. Um,
oh no.
yeah, so she had this sort of thing smacked over her hands whenever she used her left hand. So she had to learn how to use her right hand
Right.
because there was something seen as abnormal for
Yes,
left-handed people.
yes,
And hearing her talk about how it became not about her left-handedness, it became like an undermining of her personality and who she was as a person,
yes,
because that level of invalidation, that something that was so inherent about her, something so natural about her that was seen as so repugnant
yes.
by teachers in the school and society in a broader sense, undermined everything about her as a person, where she actually began to find herself repugnant because of her left-handedness,
Mm.
and beyond that as a person. It's something that never has left her, I don't think, even now, even though she's a proud lefty now.
Yeah,
In terms of handiness, she still has that element of the scorn of society for her being left-handed. And human history has taught us, that whether it be which hand you use naturally, or whether it be your eye color, your skin
yes,
pigmentation, your the type of hair that you have,
yes.
whether it be your sexuality, your
Yeah,
gender identity, anything that makes you who you were, and any societal scorn upon that thing does have this really pernicious, deep acting undermining of a person's very identity and who they were born to be.
absolutely.
And what is extraordinary for me in a one therapy sense is how much people have been undermined in society just for being who they were born to be. Just their
Absolutely.
natural state of being and existence has been so crapped upon
Yeah,
by society and other people, and particularly people in authority, that they have all of the almost like this fragmentation or splintering in their psyche at a very, very basic level, a foundational level.
yeah.
And sometimes it takes a lifetime to heal that fragmentation, to get rid of those splinters from the
Mm.
psyche. Sometimes people never do it in their lifetime. That's where, for me, the one therapy experience, for example, with the universal constant of Reiki, is so powerful, because when we come up against that splintering, that fragmentation on this very fragile part of our psyche, that everything is supported on. It's right there at the very beginning that everything else sits upon. And when we buffer up against that and we come across it, our being, our who we are as a person reacts to it, and you get these sort of very deep level, sort of moments of like shock and awe and, oh my god, this is just awful. You just feel like the whole world is coming down around you. And that's when, for me, the universal constant of Reiki just seeps in. And
Yep.
it's just like, it's okay.
Yeah.
I'm here.
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
not alone in this. And
Yeah.
that healing of our fundamental selves is so powerful, because yes, we can look at things about ourselves and understand very, very consciously society does not like that thing. And we can find it repugnant in ourselves. We can go the other way and actually be very proud of it, and
Mhm.
celebrate that thing about ourselves. But what about the things we don't know? What about that subtle background stuff, for things that are there on a baseline level in our body, in our psyche, in our physiology of who we are and who we were born to be, that is constantly being undermined by society and by
Right.
the media and by authority? What about those bits? Because we don't even know that those bits are fragmented and distorted and splintered. But the universal constant does. This sense of almost instantaneous healing, mending of that fragmentation. And I love how, for me, it is this sense of the kintsugi, the Japanese art of the broken crockery that is healed with the golden resin, and that sense of this for me is how Reiki acts,
Right.
in our Reiki experience, in our one therapy experience. It heals us in this way that is a celebration. It doesn't just mend so that we are a broken thing that has been mended. It's not like that. It's
Mm-mm.
about a celebration of what
Right.
makes you who you are, of the scars, of the trauma, of the pain, of the disapproval of society and one's elders throughout life. It is a celebration of how those things have sculpted us into the beautiful human beings that we are now.
Right.
From an early age, the house captivated her attention. She became aware of the magnetic pull of the house when she was about 5 or 6. She and her family would pass it on their regular visits to her uncle, who lived just beyond in the deep woods. She traveled with her parents, grandmother, brother, and pet dog in a big old Ford station wagon. She'd always sit in the way back with the hatch opened. She'd keep her eyes on the house until they crossed the bridge and it was out of sight. She was a sensitive child, one in which her parents often worried about her because she was never really anchored in place. No matter where she was, she could always see the house in her mind's eye. With its round, octagonal tower on the left front corner, which was very asymmetrical to the rest of the design. It had a one-story porch starting at the midsection of the tower, which ran all along the front and right side of the house. The vertical windows of each floor rose above one another with plain borders. As a child, she often imagined looking out from the windows in the front rooms to see a stone wall surrounding the large property. She somehow knew these rocks were sourced from the land itself, from years of plowing the land where rocks, stones, and boulders seemingly grew over the winter, where the constant frost heaves percolated them up. Within the rooms, she could see the intricate details and ornamental embellishments on the carved woodwork and fretwork. The delicate patterns and designs created by interlacing or intersecting wooden strips mesmerized her. She could almost feel her fingers touch the design and follow the pattern. Her uncle was a woodworker, and as she grew older, she just assumed it was his craft, and the hours of explaining how woodwork can be converted into beautiful artwork was really the source of what filled her mind's eye with all the details she saw. During her childhood, her uncle told stories surrounding the person who lived in the house. The whispered hearsay and gossip was passed down from one generation to another, and all the locals knew the story by heart, including him. She always felt sad for the woman in that big house all by herself. She could see the woman tall and thin, very pale skin from spending too much time indoors. Dressed in a long, dark fitted skirt, topped with a form-fitting bodice with high, narrow-cut shoulders and tight sleeves with a high collar, which made her look even taller. Her hair was severely pulled back without a strand out of place. At her neck, a jet brooch surrounded by tiny bits of marcasite sparkled, catching the light as she moved. Her eyes were crystal blue, but with a faded sparkle of long past joy. This only deepened the sense of compassion she felt for the woman, and always kept that close to her heart, never telling her uncle what she saw. Time rolled by, and one day, as she was traveling, she passed the grand old house. She noticed an open house sign. It seemed like everyone in the town were filing up and going down the long drive with eagerness to see what the inside of the house looked like. For it had been taken over by the Historical Society and restored to its former glory. This was the grand opening for everyone in the town. Without a second thought, she immediately pulled over, joining the townspeople. She caught bits and pieces of conversations, some saying an old woman had died in the house, whilst others mentioned she was unnatural, and they wouldn't be surprised if the old woman haunted the house. As she stepped over the threshold of the grand house, the guide told the history of the house. How a wealthy textile mill owner built the house for himself, wife, and daughter. Unfortunately, only 1 year after completion of the home, he died, leaving the mother and daughter in considerable wealth, yet missing the greatest part of their life. As time passed by, the daughter grew, became college educated, determined to contribute to her father's legacy. But soon thereafter, her mother died. At this point in the heiress's life, stories began to circulate she had become a recluse. Alone and without family, she spent the rest of her life behind the doors of the grand house, never venturing out. Now everything made sense to her. Knowing the story now, she understood the sadness she felt every time she remembered the house and its occupant. She wanted to rescue that one facet of this woman's life into wholeness. But how? Proceeding into a grand family parlor area, a larger-than-life portrait greeted the group. Here was the woman she had always imagined. Was it really her imagination instilled by her uncle's stories? Or was this real? The woman was dressed elegantly in a beaded dress the color of a clear summer day. A cascading train was artfully placed so the viewer could see the intricate hand-stitched detailing. The color blue matched the woman's eyes as if dyed from the very essence of the color. She held a carved sandalwood fan with a family of 3 delicately painted on the open screen. Pinned to her high neck was the brooch of jet encircled with tiny faceted marcasite. The portrait and story made her feel some old pangs of her own trauma. She quieted her heart and understood the loss this woman must have felt. She looked deeply into the eyes of the woman in the portrait and began speaking to her from her heart. I know you know the pain of grief, but this grief can change, become a reminiscent echo from the past. A fragrant bouquet of roses in a warm summer garden. A kind word echoed in time. Now is your time to transform this grief into something else. Not deep sorrow, but a recollection of love shared that goes beyond death. Your loved ones never left you. They are always with you, entwined where no time exists, with your love for them and theirs for you. A lovely scent of roses and sandalwood filled the air. Those around her were making comment of the sudden fragrance surrounding them. As the group began to follow the guide away to another room, she stood silently looking at the portrait. She smiled as her eyes wandered around the room, imagining how a party might look, where friends and neighbors would be dancing and laughing. The dancing couples passed her, and she could feel the air shift as they passed. She could even hear the crinkling of fabric as the women's gowns twirled and swirled in step with their partners. The chandeliers high above were aglow with hundreds of beeswax candles. The air smelled like honey. She felt her mouth open in shock, looking from one person to another, totally taken aback at what she was experiencing. And as if on cue, those in the room stopped dancing, and all were looking at her. The encounter shocked her and snapped her back in place. She was anchored again. She took a deep breath and with a smile thought, separation is an illusion.
This has been amazing. I love these stories.
Absolutely. And the tipple and toddy aren't so bad either. Yes, quite fun, quite I almost feel enlightened by all of this. I'm all for spooky. But is it really spooky? Is it just the unknown?
This is the amazing thing about ghost stories, and in modern times, the darker, more horror-based stories. The horror is very often real life.
Right.
And metaphorical in terms of the challenges that we face in real life. So even modern ghost stories and modern horror stories are actually a form of enlightenment for the modern age, which I find extraordinary. Do you know what? I'm having so much fun this evening, and I feel such a glow from this wonderful.
Your cheeks are quite rosy.
They are, aren't they? This spiced pudding drink tipple thing that I'm consuming has given me such a warm glow, and I'm enjoying myself so much. I think we should have some more stories, but maybe we have to listen to the wind to hear them.
Oh, wind?
Maybe we have to listen to the zephyrs to hear them.
Okay. I can do that. My toddy is delicious, as you can tell.
And obviously very alcoholic.
Very alcoholic. I think it's mostly rum, though. It's quite delicious. It is. It is quite yummy.
I'm speechless.
Oh my
Ah,
goodness.
dear. And whatever celebrations you are having, may they be warm and wonderful, and may the constant of Reiki, universal constant of Reiki, fill your holiday midwinter period with much joy and happiness.
And laughter.
And laughter. And wind.
Oh, well, only if you enjoy that sort of thing.
But until we meet again
Yes.
here for a whole new experience within the Mayfarer's Tavern.
Yes. Be enchanted.
Be enchanted.
You've been listening to the It's Reiki But Not As You Know It podcast, hosted by Martyn Pentecost, originator of One Therapy, and Linda Hadzinski, guide and companion to the One Therapy community. Find out more and join in the conversation at onetherapy.com. one-therapy.com. It's Reiki, but not as you know it.